Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Oladele Ayorinde, and I'm happy to welcome you to the Organ House concert and seminar series today. As usual, we are so excited to have our speaker presenter today, but I will come back to him shortly. For those joining us for the first time, the Organ House concert and seminar series is a space of musical exchanges, experimentation, performances, documentation. It is about music making. It's also about music sciencing. It's also about music engagement and music documentation. I mean, digital documentation. So, if you're joining us for the first time, I am so excited and I'm happy that you are here today. So, in the process of this particular seminar today, I'm going to talk a lot about how say a few things about the project we are engaging, the platform, upcoming project. But for now, uh, I would like to, welcome you officially and thanks for joining us. And for those who have been part of this movement, this particular platform, at least in the recent month, thank you for joining us again. We are so excited and always happy to have you around. We are happy because you keep us going. Your engagement, your presence, and your interest in this project is valuable and we cherish it a lot. Thank you so much for always being with us and encouraging this initiative. Today, we have a special guest. He's not so much of a guest, but I call him a guest because it's one of the renowned scholars around. We're talking about composition, music scholarship, particularly the notion of arrangement, which is a focus of today. So our guest today is quite exceptional. It's quite exemplary, and you get to know that yourself in this process. I'm also happy because I've shared a journey with him. I'm still on that path with him. I'm so happy, to have him today. He's my good friend, professional colleague. We've done a lot together, and I'm so happy that finally he's here today. So, friends and colleagues, I'd like to, welcome our colleagues today, Dr. Kgomotso Moshugi from the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa. Hello, KG. I call him KG. How are you today?
Good afternoon to everyone. I'm well, thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah, I think as our tradition is on this platform, sometimes we allow people to introduce themselves because it's better heard from the horse's mouth than from an external or third person, like you said, being the ethnography term. So, would you mind introducing yourself to our friends and colleagues meeting you for the first time, or some of them joining this platform for the first time, or seeing you for the first time?
Thank you for the platform. First and foremost, also as a way of introducing myself, I'd like to thank Dr. Ayorinde Oladele and Dr. Bayo Oyemi and Professor Elijah Oyalabi for providing me with this platform to come and sit with you for a moment and share some insights and thoughts and perhaps my journeys as a researcher and as an artistic researcher, also and practitioner. And so my journey starts, you know, well, I guess part of my presentation will integrate aspects of in my work and me introducing myself, but primarily I speak to you from the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, where I finished my PhD a few years ago with Dr. Ayorinde, and I'm glad to continue the journey to still be able to share our post-PhD work and reflections. And so I am at the institution in the School of Arts, and I work with the music, but I also teach in cultural policy and management. And one of my passion areas of teaching and maybe practice is creativity. And I think that will come out a lot more as I share the rest of my presentation. Um, but I am a son of the soil and I love people and I love seeing Africa and Africans finding their voice and their place in the world and redressing really the ills of the past that has kind of displaced us as Africans, both intellectually and in many ways physically. So I'm here so that hopefully some of our conversations will be underscored, I think, by the bigger project of not rehumanizing the African, but perhaps reasserting the human in the African.
Thanks so much, KG. Yeah, I think for some of us those joining us for the first time, as mentioned earlier, that is KG. Of course, you get to know more about him, his work during the presentation, and you know, without delaying further, I think I will hand over the baton to KG to lead us. KG, the platform is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Oladele. In preparation for this presentation, several key uh, inquiries were critical to me, or should I say, it was important for me to get a sense of who is in the room, who will be participating, I guess, in the form of listening, um, who will be in the audience and what kind of interests do they hold, so that even as I speak, I can speak in ways that can help us connect with the realities of our inquiries and where we are mentally and so forth. And so it's good to see everyone in the room and to know that I'm in the company of the like-minded people who are interested in music, but also who are interested in centering the value of the human beings who produce and encounter music. So my presentation today may entail at certain points like a typical PowerPoint slide here and there, but I'd like to really just proceed with this conversationally. And from time to time, I will read from a script because some of the ideas are more coherently articulated there. But for today, as a starting point, I'd like to just share with you that, when I started my PhD, I came from two points of convergence. Firstly, as an arts practitioner whose task for many years was to create music and provide creative direction. And secondly, my role was to also provide administrative leadership in one of the artistic outfits that I was serving. And so by default, my journey in the cultural and musical space has demanded of me to be a creative, at the same time also provide leadership. And those two sides of my work have always kind of shown up in my scholarship as well. And so my MA was in cultural policy and management, and my PhD well, my PhD was in music. And so um, I have had the privilege to have a convergence of these two sides also in scholarship beyond the conventional practice that I have held for many years. And so when I was having to conceptualize a PhD project, having done an MA that was deeply steeped, having had to do an MA program that was deeply steeped in an administrative quest. I had to rethink and reframe a PhD, and I had an opportunity to build a creative project. And so I built, I looked at, the work that I had done, both as a composer and an arranger. And I knew that there were areas of my work that demanded, that required me to pay attention specifically to aspects of. So the PhD gave me an opportunity to raise the type of questions that I could not have tackled anywhere else, but it was an opportunity to probe the creative side of the work that I have done. But I had an opportunity to raise particular type of questions that were informed by my practice. But at the time of the development of my PhD, I was confronted with the opportunity also, or the dynamic of evaluating the disciplinary, I could say, location of my inquiry. Even though initially I didn't think of it as a positioning of the inquiry, it did come out in my proposal presentation when some of the professors read my proposal and they asked the question, they say, is this work in ethnomusicology or is it a musicology project? And they insisted that I would need to take a clear stand and a clear position as to where I want to locate my project moving forward. And so that left me with a not so much unsettling thought, but it raised a question that I had to, I guess, resolve as I continued with the PhD. And so I continued to think and rethink and read and reread. But in my university, what was interesting at the same time was that there was a wave of probing the idea of artistic research or creative research. And when I came in, I also had an opportunity to consider what creative research would offer the kind of inquiry that I was trying to frame. And because I was coming from a position of practice as an arranger, composer, that creative practice enabled me to kind of establish a sense of comfort with pursuing a PhD that would reside or be in a dialogical form with the creative. But what that would look like, I had no idea, and how to center that in scholarship was always a big question. And especially because in those days, creative projects were also not very clearly defined and very clearly foregrounded. And in some cases, it was also a contested terrain where some institutions were wondering if creative work can constitute research. And so one of my challenges was to ensure that in my framing of the creative research, I center my work as a viable academic inquiry. Because if you think about it, one can say, what is a creative inquiry? What is a creative project, as opposed to a creative project that is inherently created to serve artists and audiences? So these are two distinctions: a project that serves audiences and artists, and a project that serves academic purposes. So that needed to be something that I clarify and that I consider in my work. And so this led me to exploring various types of literature, some of which I will share with you shortly, in terms of just finding my footing and getting the register and the language and establishing the proper canons within which to probe this idea of, of creative practice. So I will disclaim very early on that although I was keen to work with the idea of creative research, I was also slightly unsettled by working with a register that had not at the time found enough footing in academia. So I didn't want to work on a creative project that would compromise the academic project or that would compromise me in the end. And so I had to ensure that even as I engage with the project that is creative, I am able to center it in ways that are not questionable, especially from those areas of the academy where questions had not been settled around creative practice as research. And so my inquiry was really, really informed by the empirical reality of the mobility of hymns from their Euro-American origin to African locations. And by hymns, I mean Christian poetry and words, as we have known and encountered through mainstream churches or churches that have origins in the Euro-American space and that use also the conventional hymns, Christian hymns that were popularized since the 1700s, 1800s, and some in the 1900s. And so I was wanting to study the qualities of transforming or the qualities that transform in the process of their shift from their point of origin. And so already, thinking about that, the hymn as a creative artifact, and the social context and the cultural context. So those were the ideas at the back of my mind. So there was a lot of contextual consideration, and in as much as there was a lot of content consideration. But in the process, I realized that so there are particular ways of thinking about moving objects and how in the movement of objects there's a relocation geographically, there's a relocation culturally as well. And in the process of cultural relocation, there are intersections where one cultural artifact encounters a different cultural interpretation, which then infused produces an altered artifact to a point where the same artifact doesn't look and sound the same in a relocated region as it sounds in its point of origin. And so that became really my preoccupation in terms of where and how to frame my inquiry and my project. And so I had to deal with a lot of theoretical ideas, and I had to deal with a lot of ideas that kind of help to distill this cultural intersection and mobility, just the idea of mobility. So I'm giving you all this context because I am trying to get you to have a sense of the kind of problem that I was confronted with, that I was endeavoring to resolve through the decisions that I was making and the scholarship that I was consulting and my reading of the scholarship. And so in that sense, let me then just read you some of the pages just to frame for you my initial thinking. So basically, in the tradition of thought that has attempted to account for culture in various fields, such as anthropology, sociology, literary studies, and ethnomusicology, international and local scholars have raised numerous theories and terminology in describing or representing different cultures as they intersect. At this point, I wish to state that through colonization endeavors, missionization, and traveling companies, by traveling companies, I mean those performers who would seek performance platforms outside of Europe, some of which came to South Africa in the 1800s. So through all those, Euro-American music and its other cultural practices were introduced to, for instance, the Southern African context, which already had its diversity of indigenous cultures. So the arrival of colonizers and the arrival of missionaries and these traveling companies, as they were bringing Americanized forms of cultural expressions through music, they did not arrive in a context that was void of its own culture. But what happened is that they were adding to the cultural register of the landscape and the soundscape of the local region. So in observing histories in studies on choral cultures, for instance, the word intercultural and transcultural are some of the terms scholars use to explain the merging of cultures or the result of what comes out when cultures merge. In these cultural fusions, musical intellectual trajectories were redefined, reoriented, some coalesced through means that I would like to argue reflect from forms of transnationalism and indigenization. So a relationship between the local and the newly arriving. So Western hymns, American spirituals, and folk songs were infused in traditional musical elements and African vernacular languages through translations and new compositions. So recent scholars have referred to these musical developments, compositions, and arrangements as a process of defamiliarizing. So when you take a familiar piece and you rearrange it, so that's a term some would use. I think it's Agau who speaks about defamiliarization. And some scholars would say it's an eclectic, that's Grant Ulrich. Some would say it's hybrid, some would say it's authentic, some would say neo-traditional. And so these scholars were finding these terms to kind of explain this phenomenon of the merging of cultures. And in one example, Veit Elman shows Istratamia, one of the emergent styles, as a force field of conflicting and intersecting aesthetics and ideologies. It's an interesting way of how he read this as conflict, and the fact that he chose the word force field and conflict of aesthetic intersections and ideologies, in as much as perhaps you see it as a conflict if there's an intention to keep them separate. But when you accept them as a phenomenon of social cultural development, perhaps the word conflict is not fully descriptive of the moment of intersection. But I appreciate the idea of thinking about how these two perhaps come from different places, and maybe that in and of itself may translate into something that seems conflicting. Well, so this concept raises an essential theoretical dimension for my study related to aesthetics and ideologies in the context of coexisting transnational and indigenous epistemological inclinations in local arranging practices concerning hymns. Here I acknowledge a particular scholarship on which I premise my engagement in various concepts. And so I just want to reiterate that. So the idea here that I'm engaging with is that I'm trying to look at arranging, but what is arranging? Arranging is described in jazz as a form of, giving character and musical qualities to different elements of a piece, or adapting a piece that may have been written for a small ensemble to work for a big ensemble and reorganizing the musical structures and parts, etc. But in my case, I'd also like to think of arranging as a form of composition, because the elements that as a creative person you have to temper with, or that uh, in your disposal as an arranger, are the same elements that are at your disposal as a composer. So the composer still works with the same elements that an arranger may work with, except that an arranger will have a very specifically articulated point of reference, whereas a composer may not necessarily outright put forward their point of reference. So as an arranger, it would be clear that I'm arranging, but the arrangement is of a particular hymn or a particular piece, whereas a composer may be inspired by a particular piece, but they may not always in the music represent what has inspired them in ways that are more explicit, like in an arrangement, for instance. And so um, back to this idea then of intersections. So how are you arranging? What are you arranging? What do you infuse it with? And what is at play in your soundscape, in your imagination of or reimagination of a piece? So I had to consider some theoretical ideas and work with some scholarship to kind of really find ways of locating myself, but also find ways of thinking about the project itself, of reimagining hymns or observing their reimagination as a result of this intersection of cultures. So a very interesting book by Hofmeyr, um, A Translational History of the Pilgrim's Progress, within a broader context of literary studies, um, engages with the history that leads to an understanding that the portable in the title, for instance, depicts the movement of the Book of Bunyan, which Hofmeyr wrote about. So Hofmeyr sets out to observe in her work how Bunyan was translated um, and circulated in most parts of Africa, although it was written, of course, in the Western region. She argues that the academic study of the Banyan, has been dominated by a national view that recognizes the English in his identity and work. In her observation, this has undermined the transnational nature and stature of his work. So here the argument is that you look at Bunyan and you associate it with English, but the work that has happened or that has unfolded as a result of the Bunyan outside of Western contexts has not always been foregrounded in the literary scholarship to which Hofmeyr is contributing with this book. So firstly, she traces how the Pilgrim's Progress by Bunyan was integrated with Africa through the evangelical Protestant movement. So through her book, essentially, I was able to depict the movement of a particular literary work that had to serve the purpose of missionization. But I was able to observe its portability and mobility, as I was also considering the mobility of a hymn. I was able to engage with the ideas of mobility as she was able to share them here. So the idea of transnationalization in my thinking came about through engagement with this work that Hofmeyr presented about the transnationalization of the Banyan. And her theoretical orientation focuses on three main areas: translatability and its limits, material and social practices of translation and circulation. So I guess these were some of the problems that she was confronted with in dealing with the mobility of the Bunyan. But also this, I think, presents or presented for me some useful ways of thinking about the mobility of the Euro-American hymn as opposed to a conventional literary work. So I consulted the work of Kwasi Wiredu, a philosopher who produced something useful, a useful work in cultural spaces. And, I observe in his work a conceptual relationship that connects communication, culture, universality, particularity with community and humanity. His position is that intercultural communication affirms cultural universals that are commonly enabled by a scheme of concepts. He asserts that communication is an essential necessity in human life. The human being is a product of culture, and that the person-making qualities of developing the mind requires culture and society. So he further suggests that communication involves conceptualization and articulation. He looks at culture as an objective universality, how people think and act, and subjectivity as the process of accounting for various types of relativity. His position is that what unifies human beings is more compelling and common than that which renders us differently without undermining prevailing differences. And so he really presented for me a useful concept of thinking about cultural particulars and cultural universals, and thinking about this mobility of hymns and how the idea of interpreting hymns sits in the universal nature of culture making and culture interpretation or cultural expression, in as much as the remaking of a hymn engages with a particularity in the origin of the hymn as a Western artifact. So how it is remade and reimagined in African context becomes the product of it is received as a particular, but because of the universality of culture, that affords or enables a reinterpretation and a reimagination in a new particularity. Even though, of course, we know that in the hegemony of cultures, there's always politics of dominance, which for many, many years undermine local cultures and African cultures, to be specific. And so the idea of thinking about universals and particulars was to help assert the value of reimagining Euro-American hymns and then recognizing features of the reimagined version and the value that they hold in the creative spectrum of arranging and composition. And so, I engaged with other works, old works really, but one scholar who studied Nietzsche's work as a philosopher expresses his high regard for music unwaveringly. He provides music viewpoints from a philosophical perspective and philosophy from a musical outlook, which also recenters the idea of music in Africa as more than just a mundane practice that results in culture, but it shows that there's a music inherently is philosophical, is a project of thought as much as it's a project of experience and encounter. And so, some of these ideas, they do not particularly work in one culture and are absent in another. If music has value in one culture, it should then be observed in another culture for the value that it holds in that different culture. And so while there are numerous other ideas that I explored, that permeated my thoughts. Excuse me. That permeated my thoughts as I tried to conceptualize the study. So these were some of the ideas that foregrounded my thinking. And I will skip forward and will not mention all of them at this point. But I want to then move on to highlight that after all this, I still remain with the question of finding a suitable theoretical framework that would enable me to study the idea of mobility of hymns with the appreciation of aspects of this mobility that have often been overlooked in scholarship. And so I was drawn to the idea of systems thinking, specifically because the idea of systems recognizes that although something works as a whole, it's a whole that is made up of components and subcomponents. Arnold and Wade, concerned with the existing and limited definitions of system thinking, for instance, embark on a study to produce and propose an integrative description that considers and represents essential components of a system. And so they offer that systems thinking is a set of synergistic analytical skills used to improve the capability to identify and understand systems, predict their behavior, and devise modifications to them to produce desired effects. So essentially what is underscored here is that if you're going to adopt systems thinking, then by implication, you are thinking systemically because you're observing something that works in and of itself as a system. And in order to be understood, it needs a systems way of thinking. To maybe clarify that further. So if something operates as a system and it's got subcomponents, if you study it without appreciating it as a system, there are components and subcomponents that will not be underscored or highlighted for the value they hold in the system. But when you study a system from a lens of appreciating it as a system, then that enables you to probe various elements that integrate in forming a whole. And so that's the idea behind systems thinking that I thought could be useful in studying what, in my view, was a complex mobility, which was not always appreciated for its complexity. And so, for instance, I'll give you an example. When I was proposing my PhD, one of the readers came back and said, you are highlighting here that you want to look at translation, hymn translation. And hymn translation is not so interesting. We would be interested in hearing about the musical elements. While I appreciated that critique from the reader, it came to me also as a gift, because following that critique, I then decided to go deep in my study to prove and show the value that translations hold beyond them being mundane shifts from one language to another. And so, as I will indicate before the close of my talk, what then happened in my observation of translation and revaluing of translation as part of the system. So, considering this idea of systems, I then found a study that has been conducted that observes systems no longer from a position of engineering, because systems thinking comes from engineering thought and ideas around design and so forth. But then these scholars adopted it for creative context, and they started thinking about how, there's no consensus among scholars in terms of understanding what creativity is. Some will concerned with how investigations in each subfield seem oblivious of the developments in another field. So scholars in psychology will say creativity is a cognitive function, and scholars elsewhere would advocate for it differently. And so these scholars became proponents of a systems view of creativity towards a broad, encompassing approach to study and understand what it is. So they proposed that researchers should recognize that creativity itself arises from a web of interrelated forces operating at multiple levels that can only be modeled and understood via interdisciplinary investigations. And so I mentioned creativity here because arranging itself, the operational exercise and activity of altering musical elements or replacing and displacing them is a function of creativity. And so I consulted the scholarship and came up with these, came across these ideas and these scholars. But so the important thing here is that so there's a recognition that creativity has got to be understood more broadly than from just one particular field of study or thought. So psychologists are applying sociological perspective to the study of creativity, benefiting from the work being done by sociologists. So here you see the convergence of psychology and sociology in trying to understand creativity. So the positions stated above between psychological and sociological thought towards understanding creativity, how somehow help to locate the making of art as a product of creativity, integrating social and humanistic scholarship. So Becker, for instance, problematizes that sociology and art literature acknowledge systems and correlations without recognizing people, like arrangers in my study, in those systems and the collective activities of people involved. So it somewhat decenters the people, the human beings, the active agents. Upon this, he establishes a premise for his inquiry into art as a collective action. So my consideration of this proposition is its multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary approach, though implicit, of making creative work a complex process. So both Becker and Hennessy, these scholars, offer complexity of art and creativity, and that then requires a complex response in terms of theoretical understanding. So I then came across a systems model of creativity, which was a product of Csikszentmihalyi, who studied creative individuals from various fields, disciplines, and backgrounds. So he departs from the premise that psychologists have often treated creativity as a solely psychological occurrence. Instead, he suggests that a robust definition of creativity must assume an intersubjective position, embracing both the individual and the audience, considering that their surrounding cultural and social factors are at play when they create. So his study is preceded by his keen interest in creativity. And the following paragraphs, of course, will kind of help detail what his conceptualization of creativity is. And in that case, I would like to share something with you. So in the screen that I am sharing, you will see that this is the creative systems model that Csikszentmihalyi produced, and it's got the cultural system, the generic makeup of, okay, so let's say it's got the domain, the person, and the field, and the domain is the cultural system. The person is the genetic makeup of talents and experiences, and the field is the social system. So essentially, he has got these systems, the cultural, the social, and the personal or individual, at play, collectively working to produce what results in the end as creativity. So through this, there's a type of complexity here in that then it means that we're looking at the relationship between the person, the cultural domain, and the field, and the resulting creativity. And we are able through this kind of model to study the individual, at the same time study the cultural context, and at the same time study the system. So according to Mihaly, once an individual that, for instance, belongs to a particular cultural outfit will be inspired by their cultural context to create something of an artistic output. And once they do that, using how they understand that culture and how they interpret and how they apply their own ideas onto the reimagination of a particular cultural outcome or output, then they create what becomes an innovation or a novel product. However, this novel product is not without aspects of what is drawn in the cultural domain. So the cultural domain shapes and informs what the person is able to do artistically. And once they have produced an output, that output is encountered by the field, the social system, a community of practice or gatekeepers who have power to determine whether that work sees the light of day or that work is able to make it into the cultural system. And once approved by the field and the social system, that particular work goes into the cultural system. Once it's in the cultural system, then according to Mihaly's idea, then creativity has occurred as a system. However, if you're thinking about creativity as a system, once you create something as an individual, talented and so forth, but your work does not make it into the cultural system, it means that your work does not change, improve, or add to the cultural system or the cultural domain, which means that your work then doesn't manifest as creativity. It might be a creative thing that you, or a creative exercise that you engage in, but if the work itself does not change the cultural domain, then it doesn't manifest from a systems perspective as an outcome of creativity. So in that sense, creativity will not have been accomplished. So what this means is that one can also then look at creativity in terms of those activities that individuals or groups of individuals engage in that alter the cultural system. So in this sense, it means that one was then able to consider how in the movement of hymns, there were changes that were effected that may not have in and of themselves been considered for their contribution to creativity, right? And so this systems model of creativity, for me, it provided a premise to then have a more comprehensive engagement with the context of creating hymns, the context of their mobility, and the context of their relocation. As a result of studying this mobility of hymns, I was then able to identify and come up with another model that I'd like to share for you in a second. So this model here that you're seeing comes out of my study. So I went in and I did field work and I observed different archival sources. And in my interpretation of the findings that I was observing, I then identified the hymn at its point of origin. And the question I raised, as informed by the systems model, was who is involved in the creation of tunes and lyrics at point one? And so those would be the composers or the authors of particular works, right? And of course, the recognition is that these authors reside in a cultural domain of religious content. So they draw inspiration from religious practices. So some of the words, the lyrics, have a relationship with the cultural domain. They reside in that genre or canon, but they formulate to create something that is new, like a new composition, for instance. And according to my interpretation, then I move to point two, where I observe the formulation, for instance, of a particular hymnal. So a hymnal is produced out of a compilation of hymns, but someone has to take the part of compiling those hymns after they've been composed at point one. So the compiler of a hymnal is, for instance, an editor or a group of editors who have to work with publishers of hymnals to make the hymnals available. So often you don't find that the composers of tunes themselves own hymnals, but the hymnals are owned by publishers, and publishers own hymnals of hymns that are owned by the composers and arrangers. And at point three, you can see there that although it's point three, but the arrows on the sides that point show what contributes to what makes point three, for instance. So missionaries move to a territory, and like an office of the church formalizes the movement of those missionaries, makes decisions to enable and support with resources the movement of hymns, but rather the movement of missionaries who carry hymns on one hand and Bibles on another, and bring it to a local territory at point four, where they are encountered by locals, but then also translated into local languages through the intervention of the church leadership and the translators themselves, and so forth. So you can look at that. So the middle blocks lead from one all the way to six. And at point six, I've written there ensembles, because there's a particular tradition outside of congregations that hymns can be taken as specialized, concertized items, where they are arranged in particular ways for recordings and for live performances. But what is also important is to observe point one and point six, how they converge on the bottom block. And the bottom block basically implies that after observing all the institutions and individuals that contributed to the movement of particular hymns and the compilation of those hymns into hymnals and translations and so forth, one is able to evaluate then the qualities of the hymn at point one and the qualities of the hymn at point six. And through an evaluation of these qualities, then one can determine whether the qualities have changed. And if the qualities have changed, it means that the hymn at its local point is no longer the hymn at its point of origin. And asking the question how it has changed, who was responsible for the change, then enables a recognition of contributions that come from other role players outside of the original composer of the hymn. And so to study and look at a hymn or credit the qualities of a hymn at its relocation and credit the composer of the hymn is not complete, and it overlooks the institutions and the individuals who contribute in making it the kind of hymn that it becomes at the very end of the cycle. I see a comment there that there's a request for slides. Well, I'll see what I can do after the presentation to maybe share some of these things, and maybe also share some articles where some of this work can be accessed as well. But yeah, so the point of the model that I've shared with you is that I would not have been able to come up with this hymn mobility chart that enabled the recognition of other institutions in what I argue as a system of creativity. Because often creativity will say, our conventional observation of creativity will say, who composed the hymn? It's so and so. Who's the author of the words? It's so and so. Perhaps if there are changes in the qualities of the music, we might recognize the arranger. But often the translators are overlooked. They are not mentioned in local hymnals. And the institutions that enabled are not recognized. They enabled this movement. And so it's the idea of recognizing creativity and this process of how the hymns become arranged at the local point, or the fact that they are arranged ultimately in a particular location and setting, is a function of so many institutions and individuals, means that you can then understand that mobility in and of itself, observed as a function of creativity and residing in the alteration of musical elements, helps us to then think of arranging as a system that incorporates all these role players in enabling a particular experience related to a particular piece that is then experienced or created or that manifests in a local setting. And so this is what was enabled by I kind of jumped to the end by kind of presenting the outcome of the study. But now I want to move back to before this model was formulated, to point out that, there's still a question of where does or how do I articulate the location of my study, given that, yes, I'm arguing for creative practice or creative research. And I'm working with this now, this model, but this model also is still highly, maybe we could say, social sciences based, even though it engages with the idea of creativity. And so there's a big question about, is this ethnomusicology or is this musicology? And I had to address that question somehow. So I encountered Akin Yuba's work, where he introduced the term creative musicology now. And I engaged with this term, but I realized that there's a particular meaning that he ascribed to creative musicology, which relates in this case to integrating Western and African elements in particular works in as far as folk music and Western techniques are concerned. So that convergence, using looking at indigenous music and indigenous elements in the music and translating that into what becomes art music. So Akin Yuba says, okay, so this is creative musicology. We are moving from this register, the indigenous register, into the Western register to transform the conventions, musical conventions of musicology through indigenous infusions. And so I thought that was particularly enlightening. And as I worked with his idea, I continued to then experience Stephen Feld's work, where he did a study on something that's like transcultural musicology, you know, and that came out of the broader ideas of comparative musicology. But Stephen Feld himself in his project uh, recognizes problems associated with ethnomusicology in what he denotes as an alternative to the debates on musicology and anthropology. He suggests thinking expansively, philosophically, and experimentally concerning the actual object of study in addressing the sounding worlds of indigenous geographies of difference. So what Stephen Feld did is that he studied the soundscape of Papua New Guinea at a certain point. And how he studied that was that he set up microphones in a huge veld and forest and recorded the sounds that were coming out at different times of the day, sounds of insects, sounds of people waking up, children going to school, and so forth. So that was how the tool he was using to kind of study, right? And those are some of the alternative ideas, or maybe that kind of expand but seek to be in dialogue and maybe somewhat introducing other ideas that may be related to artistic practice as a form of knowledge production. So working with these ideas, then it became clear that there are epistemological questions that have to be answered. And so as some disparities exist in the disciplinary and focus of various epistemological approaches concerning music studies. Of course, epistemology deals with a fundamental philosophical question of knowledge. Kasumaru, a philosopher and artist, presents suggestions towards an epistemology particular to art. He constructs a defense, or his defense, by providing an aesthetic view of beauty as a property, right? Characteristics of an object, meanings, and intentions to counter the conventional views in epistemology that challenge the objectivity of aesthetic judgments, right? Then Mignolo, on the other hand, proposes the idea of independence of thought and freedom of a decolonial nature. And within his mindset, I kind of work with the assumption that he refers to an epistemic disobedience as a critical feature of decolonization or response to decolonizations, which implies that there may have been epistemological frameworks and protocols that are in place that are heavily loaded with colonial weight. And disobedience epistemically to those would then introduce and foreground other forms that are excluded in the conventional discourse. So this is so with the intention to expand the very terrain of knowledge through approaches that do not in totality subscribe to only one stream or discipline in musical studies. So it is within this broad context that I've had to then sit and say, what does musicology offer? What does ethnomusicology offer? But what is the object that I'm looking at? And one could say sometimes the object should guide the frameworks that should inform how it is studied. Of course, we can approach an academic project from different angles, and we can justify and build arguments for our choices. But in my case, then I had to work with these paradigms and recognize that I was not isolating myself from the conventional disciplines of studying music, but I was seeking to foreground a dimension of studying music that was not as clearly articulated in the conventions of these disciplines. And so perhaps one could say my approach in artistic research was somewhat a convergence of some of these disciplines without being restricted by their framings. And so I consider artistic research as a mode of knowledge production in this way. A scholar, Crispin, offers valuable insights that concern specifically the scholarship of music and artistic research. Unlike other studies that are intended for different areas of the arts other than music, in the more extensive debate on how to position artistic practice research in academia and concerned with the dual nature of artistic research, Crispin distinguishes between musical practice whose target is performance to an audience and artistic research that entails musical practice intending to generate knowledge for research communities. And this is a point I made in the beginning. And so the attributes of researcher as an artist become fundamental in the evaluation of evidence generated through a proposed model, identifying musical practice in the context of either art research, research through art, or research for the art. So in these three models, moving from musical practice to artistic research requires the gathering of contextual information that informs the making of music, reflecting on the musical approach and the contextual knowledge to draw insight and understanding, and positioning this reflection, contextual information, and the musical practice in a robust methodology. So my primary interest in the movement of ideas as they encapsulated, for instance, in a hymn, their intersectionality and their meaning in their context of relocation in the form of hymns, has led me to then considering the offerings of creative practice as a central focal point from which I can then draw as I extract what is useful in musicology, as the musicology, African musicology, to integrate what artistic research in and of itself affords based on the object of my study. And so here systems thinking helps in decolonizing conventional ways of knowing by offering alternative and, in this case, expansive means of engaging with an artifact. It recognizes the necessity for complex methods in understanding or observing complex scenarios. These scholars that I stated assert the idea of an artwork as entailing a range of players in what makes the art world. And Csikszentmihalyi offers a useful systems model of creativity which considers the complexity of creative currencies and occurrences. So these also raise epistemological concerns that artistic research labors to address as a working response. I know that I probably have exceeded the allocated time, and I probably glossed over some of the aspects, but I know that I've been talking for a while, and I'd like to pause there to allow for some.
Okay. Thanks so much, KG. Thank you for that wonderful and insightful, take and taking us through your work from the epistemic direction, from the historical, even reflexive tone in your work. Thank you so much. This is so huge. Yeah, this is huge. But before, I would like, definitely, we are going to open for our friends and colleagues online to ask you questions. I just want to ask you, would you mind playing one or two examples for people to hear, particularly from your arrangement, from your works, or albums, things that you have done from this particular standpoint or this artistic research conception from this approach?
Okay. Let me find an example. I hope that the audio will come to the party.
What a friend we have in Jesus, all our sins and griefs to bear. What a privilege to carry everything to God in prayer. Oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear. All because we do not carry everything to God in prayer. Have we trials and temptations? Is there trouble anywhere? We should never be discouraged. Take it to the Lord in prayer. Can we find a friend so faithful, who will all our sorrows share? Jesus knows our every weakness. Take it to the Lord in prayer.
So, I mean, I hope the screen can show what a friend we have in Jesus. So
Yes.
there it is. There it is. That's the musical score. That's how it comes out in the original hymnal. This is now a local translation in one of the vernacular languages in South Africa, Zulu language. We can see there that the title somehow is still represented, but now the music is presented in tonic solfa. And clearly the language is different. Yet we can see on the side that the composer is still recognized somehow, right? So in the original version, you see the appearance of the author and the composer of the music. But in this version, we see only one name, which is the composer of the music and no longer the author of the words. There's no clear rationale why this is the case, because I have not been able to see the translators or the decision makers behind how to text present this, right? But from the information that is presented on this page, we see that there's no recognition of the author, which could be assumed that the way it's presented, it's as though this hymn has no author, just a composer. That's based on the information as presented, which is problematic because there certainly has been a translation, there has been a location of cultural nuances and expressions that have resulted in this vernacular expression. And so in my work, then I go on to expand this argument in this way. And I say, well, I mentioned the issue with translation that a reader had with my proposal. And so I took that as a gift. And that gift landed me with the creation of what I call the translation grid, where I took the original words in English. This is really what the third or second verse, we can have it later. If you translate it directly in Zulu, this is how it looks, and this is how it reads. Sibuthataka sithwele kanzima. But if you look at the hymnal itself, it's not using direct translation. It's using siyasindwa imithwalo, which means that the translator the translators did not use direct translation because direct translation could not work for the relocation of him. So they had to understand the language enough to make the language work with the music without the language losing meaning and expression. So they had to work with the language to maintain the devotional integrity of the hymn with no compromise, even as they move away from direct translations. So to say that it's a mundane process of merely moving from one language to another is a misappropriation of value and a reduction of an exceptional exercise in the process of interpreting and localizing hymns. Because when you go on, then you can see that the actual translation now in English, when you take it back to English, it doesn't look like the original, does it? The words, they don't look like the original, which is just evidence that it's no longer the same expression as it was in the beginning. So this was one of the grades that I created to argue, drawing from the findings, to argue that perhaps we need to think about translations as a process of reauthoring for a local context rather than just translation. So I argue that that wasn't translation. That wasn't just moving from one language to another. It was a process of creating cultural access for locals. And so, I mean, so in one instance, I argue that, so I'm going to play you now a local quartet that performed the same hymn in the 1960s. And they performed it in English, right? But they performed it locally.
What a friend we have in Jesus, all our sins and griefs to bear. What a privilege to carry everything to God in prayer. Oh, what peace we often forfeit. Oh, what needless pain we bear. All because we do not carry everything to God in prayer. Every trials and temptations is a trouble anywhere. We should never be discouraged. Take it to the Lord in prayer.
So that's a snippet of a performance in Africa by the King's Messengers Quartet in the 1960s. So now this is evidence that what was composed in the Western context is now alive and fully expressional in a local context in Africa. Now, we can look at this exercise and still go back and say, oh, wow, that was a beautiful composition, and still give credit to the composer. But what we would be overlooking is that the composer's work would not be understood and experienced in the local setting had it not been through the agency of the voices that are at play when we listen to the music. So these voices, you had to utilize agency, African agency, to make available the experience, the sonic qualities of this hymn in the local context. And that's just an image to show the King's Messengers Quartet. This is them in Zambia with President Kaunda. And yeah, so that's one argument that, okay, so if you look at creativity only from a position of composition and composer, then this performance by the King's Messengers holds no valuable place in the spectrum of creativity, except just as performers. But I want to build an argument that this performance is enabled through the agency of their voices in ways that would not be experienced and encountered in Africa if it was not for their engagement of that agency. Then next, I want to play for you an arrangement that I made, interpreting this hymn and working with local language from that local translation. So I arranged the hymn and I reworked some parts of it. Let me play it for you.
Yeke isihlobo sethu Jesu uthwala izono zethu kuhlukuza konke ngakho ukukhuleka siyalahla ukuthula okungamnaki asikusangane konke kuyu Jehova asikusangane konke kuyu Jehova sinenhlupho nezilimo kanye nenkathalo singahlala ngesibindi konke sikusekuye sotola ngaphi sihlobo esinjengoJesu na osethanda esizwela masikhuleka kuye osethanda esizwela osethanda esizwela osethanda esizwela masikhuleka kuye siyasindwa yimithwalo sehlulwa zinhlupho na uJesu isiphephelo nxa sikhuleka kuye siyadela sikudela khuleka enkosini lokukoni kududuze ezingalweni zayo siyadela sikudela khuleka enkosini yokukoni kududuze ezingalweni zayo sikudela khuleka enkosini yokukoni kududuze ezingalweni zayo. Hey, 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 hey.
So those are some of the examples that Ayorinde.
Thank you so much, KG. Yeah, I was just telling my friend that your work is historical. And I remember clearly that work, how powerful. And of course, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. But I'm happy you played that example because it's very, very important in this context. What we are discussing now, your presentation, is actually very important for ongoing conversation, not only in musicology, particularly in this part of the world, Nigeria. There's an ongoing conversation in art music, artistic research, composition, and there are different, voices. All of them are powerful, they are great, but we need this kind of perspective to intensify, to make the case further or clarifications. what you are bringing on board is, for me, a kind of decolonial approach that is rooted in Africa. People talk about African music, African arrangement, African art music. Yeah. Would you, okay, I have one question, then I will open up, we'll invite our friends and colleagues. So you talking about your work, of course, from the analysis, the performative, and listening to it rings, bells in terms of a kind of decolonial process, not totally departing from the Western framework, but reproducing something new, like a model. Will you classify yourself, of course, I know you've done a lot of composition also. Will you see yourself as a kind of genealogy into the conversation around African art music?
Yeah, I think the problem with scholarship is that we often fall into these canons and the definitions of canons, and the canons then, by falling into them, there's a need for compliance, and sometimes that compliance needs to look a certain kind of way. And so it's almost like even though we speak decoloniality, but we reinvent it by other means. And while I think of myself in art music, the question that I have is, will the scholars in art music recognize me as a scholar in their terrain? Because the tendency is that they ring fence what they do and somewhat impose expectations that if you are to belong to this fraternity of scholarship, then we need to see your music in this manner or in that manner. But I look forward to perhaps maybe one rethinking a paper that would integrate some debates around African art music, and one can maybe use the scholarly platform to articulate that and to argue for a recognition of some of these kinds of works as African art music.
Yeah, well, thanks so much. Of course. As you know, we are having such plans between 16 and July 18. We have created a platform, an international symposium on African art music, negotiating the conceptualization, and also the future practices. So that's, for us, is a space we have created for this kind of expectation, to renegotiate what constitutes African art music. Who are the scholars? What are the underlying, institutionalized ideologies, or we can say, epistemologies in terms of artistic practice, compositional practice, and scholarly approaches. Yeah. So this is it. We have planned for that, and we are looking forward to that engagement with colleagues across the world. Yeah. So at this moment, I would like to open the floor to our colleagues and friends online. I'm sure you have questions for KG. I call him KG. His name is Dr. Kgomotso Moshugi. Thanks so much for that wonderful presentation. And I think, yeah, thank you. That's all I can say. So, friends, if you have questions, please raise your hand, and then I'll invite you quickly, so we can engage KG for this presentation and argument. Yeah, let's go, Dr. Sama. Just let's have you, please.
Yeah, good afternoon, Dr. Moshugi. I was not until Dr. Ayorinde pronounced your name. I didn't get the pronunciation, and I was wondering if you're a Yoruba man or Zulu man, because it sounded like Kgomotso, so I was asking whether you're also part of the mobility. Maybe we could encounter, or maybe that can be traced to your name. That's on a lighter note. It's good to connect with you. When you started your presentation, it was kind of very engaging in terms of theoretical, insight that you generated. So I was wondering, where is this man going to land? And I'm happy that we moved and we sailed successfully. I mean, thank you for this deep theoretical insight that you have taken us through in your exploration of mobility of hymns, especially how they move from one context, one creative context to another creative context. And especially the intervention of one of your reviewers that led you to this thinking of systems of creativity, which I find very informative. And this also connects, I mean, I see this as effort of scholars, trying to decenter the whole idea of the notion of creativity, as troubling the Western ideas of creativity. If we bring the works of Salzberg and Meyer, who talked about creativity in transition. That's the way I read your effort. So the question I'm interested in, which you pointed out in your in the chart you give to us on the movement of hymns, is the role of the gatekeepers, those you call gatekeepers in the social system, if I get you correctly. The editors, publishers, recording agents, and all that these people determine what goes back to the culture. So the culture, influences the creator. The creator sends it to this social system, and this social system determines whether this work goes back into, and until when and if this work goes back to the culture, creativity had not taken place, if I add it correctly. So the question I'm interested in, how would you tell this social system, are they at local level or global level? If they're at local level, how do they play this out? How is this played out at local level? If at global level, how do these gatekeepers, I like to use a word, continue or discontinue this triadic trajectory that you try to paint in this whole system of creativity? Again, I'd like to thank you for this deep insight that you have shared with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, and and for paying attention to these details, and for your reflection as well on the presentation. So I think the issue of gatekeeping is we could look at it in a scaled manner. We can scale gatekeeping. We could look at, like you're saying, international is maybe a form of scaling it, but also, a macro, micro scale. And there are ways in which, if you think about your work, perhaps gatekeeping happens at a micro, local level. And whereas there are other avenues that open. So we need to understand that there are levels and layers of gatekeeping, right? And I think in each particular case, one should be able to understand who the gatekeepers are in their particular sphere of artistic practice. Because without understanding who the gatekeepers are, it's almost as though also the positioning of the works we do will not necessarily push the gates open, right? So, for instance, I'll give you an example. If you are in a Roman Catholic church and you happen to create this kind of music, the question is, for you as an ensemble or as an arranger or a composer, to have your works performed in the local Catholic church, who make decisions about whether or not that work can be experienced, consumed in that particular subcultural context, right? And this question will have different responses depending on the particular domain that each creator and each creation evolves from. And so in this instance, if you're creating and it's a Roman Catholic setting, then the question is, when you have an artistic creation, who listens to it and who can move you off the stage if you perform that? And we know this, that there are certain pieces, there are certain outfits, musical ideas that you can't present neatly in particular religious contexts, right? And the reason for that is that there are people who will outright push back at those ideas and say, no, we do not accept that kind of music in this church, right? So those become as a type, an example of gatekeeping for someone, for instance, who writes in a particular church context and who seeks to penetrate the cultural domain of that particular church. But the same composition could work, for instance, argument's sake, in a different setting where one creates the same composition, the same arrangement, the same musical outfit, the same performance, but then a record company outside of the church says, oh, this will work in the market, right? So then you access a slightly differently placed cultural domain because of the accessibility of that domain. And by this, I'm also coming back to say, so when we create, based on this idea of creativity as a system, the idea is that when we create, you create with cognizance of the gatekeepers and the cultural domain, and you play with that. And sometimes some of the works that have achieved success are not only works that rely on the artist and their novel ideas, but they are the kind of works that have been able to penetrate the social field, the social system, and push the gatekeepers in, and then the work goes into the cultural domain. I'm saying gatekeeping is real. And because gatekeepers are real, they are experts sometimes in a field who will say, oh no, this doesn't qualify. You submit your paper somewhere and the editors say, oh no, this is not part of what we would like to publish. So your paper will not go into circulation and it will not be read by people that you were trying to reach because those who make decisions do not recognize it as worthy work to be circulated in their domain. So that's an example, but the idea is that we have to be aware of the domain. So in the same way that sometimes you write your paper and you kind of say, okay, this journal that I'm writing to, this is the expectations of the editors. This is the kind of content that they are looking for. So you don't change your work, but you allow yourself to also think through the minds of the editor. And the proposition here is how do you work with that in terms of your creative work and the arranging of the music in ways that then can allow you to move your work from the point of creation to the point of circulation. So, and these are questions we should be raising at a local level and at an international level. And the gatekeeping at international level the politics of gatekeeping may be different at each level. And at an international level, we know there's issues of algorithms when we put our music out there, and there's questions of prejudice as to where does this music come from. So it could be multiple types of politics at play when it comes to accessing or breaking through the gates. But I think these are essential questions to raise and to think about even as we pursue the creation of our works. I'd like to just say that, also some criticism to the idea of the system. So the system doesn't recognize the work that is extraordinary, that has got exceptional aesthetic qualities, as long as that work doesn't make it through the system and land in the cultural domain. So you can sit with an extraordinary, aesthetically rich artifact, but if it's not in circulation, then that creativity remains limited. So it doesn't work with the view of the system. It may be recognized as creativity from a viewpoint of cognitive activity, right? But as a system, it doesn't work like that. So I'm saying, so these are ways of thinking about creativity that helps us to question how we are working, but also that helps us to recognize the contributions of others and institutions and how they affect whether our works are able to change the world, to change the cultural domain.
Yeah, thank you for that response. I got it. I thank you. Just one more. Dr. Ayorinde, please oblige me just one more before, so I can be done for today.
Okay, okay.
I was just going to ask on this issue of the meeting points, the point of relocation, like you pointed out. From point 1 to point 6, there's a point of relocation, as you describe it. And that's where you talk about, centering voices. You talk about when a text, an artistic work moves from one culture to another, certain players, stakeholders should be acknowledged. So are you saying that, for instance, the example you give, the name of the author is acknowledged and the name of the translator should be acknowledged? Is that what you are saying? Or that even the person who even transcribe literally from English to English, but transcribing from staff notation to tonic sulfur should be acknowledged as either the translator or the editor? I just want you to make some clarification. What exactly are you saying in this, acknowledging other behind the scenes stakeholders in those whole transformation process?
Yeah. Well, I guess the point that I'm making is that these other contributions, they are not recognized. The fact that we should even ask if we should recognize them is because they are questionable, right? We wonder if the translator is even a contributor. We wonder even if the transcriber is a valuable contribution. But my argument would be, so we must evaluate the value of their insertion or intervention, right? And we say, okay, so what does transcriptions do in this particular domain? And what does translation do in this particular domain? Because then we can assess the value of a translation and then determine the extent to which we want to recognize translation and the translator. So the argument is that there's more that goes on to the works that are circulated than is recognized. And I'm making a case for us to sit back and really observe the interventions along the way that enable the relocation of a particular artwork in our local setting, in our cultural domain. And perhaps I am saying, let's recognize all, because all have contributed.
Thank you
I
so much.
see. Yeah.
Okay, do we have other? Okay, yes, let's have your paper.
Thank you very much, Doctor, for the well-researched and well-pondered presentation. You did not only affirm your position or your movement with words of mouth, but with well-researched even charts and models to confirm, to solidify your position. Thank you very much. So I want to think a little bit in the line of original compositions, because we know there's a saying that goes, there is no new song, right? Like every new song must have been a bounce off of a collection of songs the composer have heard or in time past or over time. So I want to ask, Doctor, what is the place of original compositions, even though they have elements of various cultures in them? What is the place of original composition in this movement? That's in like recognizing, okay, the examples that I can remember vividly have this bounce off from existing Western hymns. And so how about an original composition? Does it fit in? Does that fit in, or does that align with the case that you have made, which is quite appealing, actually? But does original composition fit in into this movement? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, in this particular case of my study, I guess I was also trying to make a case for the underdog, and I thought arranging and hymns were not, there wasn't enough attention that was paid to the creativity that is loaded in those kind of works. But conventionally, we assume that compositions are superior. When I say I made an arrangement, the assumption is, or when we say you present an arranger and a composer, the assumption is that the composer has superiority, whether artistic or intellectual superiority, right? So there are those politics in terms of the terminology and the roles. And what I was kind of trying to assert also was to say, perhaps the arranger is a composer of another form, right? Is a type of composer. And I think we can all maybe agree that if we work with the notion that there are no creative works, then we can all say we are all arrangers, right? Even as we create compositions, we're just really arranging and reworking ideas. And that could be the language we choose to use. And the idea of saying someone is a composer or a composer is original is also a terminology that's got a history. So why were compositions called original? And in what culture and in what context? And what now informs this notion of ideas of compositions no longer being termed as original? So you can see that there's just shifts of perspectives and dimensions from which we are looking. And one could argue that perhaps if we are no longer composing and we are arranging, maybe there was never ever a composition, because even those that we think of as compositions, they were in some way arrangements informed by a particular soundscape and a particular cultural, indigenous, or whatever outfit of the time. And so I'm just saying I'm playing, I'm playing the two sides. Maybe we could support either side, but I think at this point, essentially what would be productive in terms of moving forward is to recognize that when we compose, we assume a certain type of originality, and when we arrange, there's already an assumption of the type of output that implies. And my argument is that when we are arranging, perhaps we should recognize that there are compositional elements in arranging, especially also in the example that I played last. That last section is not related sound-wise to the original hymn. It's just a new melody, new everything, right? But it was inspired from that composition, and it comes out towards the end as that particular section. So in that section, we could say, so there's a play between composition and arranging in the same piece. And I think what I'm really trying to do here is I'm trying to find ways of accounting for musical efforts and contributions and saying, but what is it that has been done to this piece? Or what creative role does this idea play? And how do we value, or what value do we place on that? But in as far as compositions themselves are concerned, I think let's just agree that that there's a particular expectation that a composition is probably. So what happens is that some compositions, for instance, when you look at hymns, I've studied hymns. So when you look at hymns, even in the 1800s, you look at them and you think to yourself, these hymns are actually similar in terms of flow, because you could take one hymn and its rhythmic patterns and its meta in terms of words and take a different hymn and fit it neatly into that same hymn. I've seen that happen. And yet, when we look at them, we say, but those were compositions, right? But however, if you go back in time and you look at what was happening there, it's possible that people were modeling compositions with the same mold, which meant that even though they were being creative at the level of maybe formulating words and writing out of particular Christian experiences and then formulating melodies of a certain kind. But if you think about some of them within the same time signature, and some of them within the same meter. So one could criticize and say, well, they were not composing also, because that was nothing new. Because I think that your argument holds even for that period of the 1800s and the 1700s in part. So we could bring it back to our current setting and say that, when you're composing in a certain genre, your originality will also be highly valued if you bring in aspects into that genre that are not expected, right? For instance, in classical music, there's expectations. It's also, there's an issue with studied forms, maybe formally studied forms, because all forms are studied, even the informal ones. So studied formal forms, because then you start to create a formula. You create a formula for jazz performance, for jazz chords, for jazz progressions. You create a formula for hymn writing. You create a formula for classical compositions. You work with the formula, you have a particular outcome, right? So the scientification of these works is almost fixing them and creating a mold that would reproduce particular type of products, right? So, and that happens in a formal sense of what is taught in the university, but also it happens in informal settings where people learn by ear. It's just that because we don't document, we may not always equate that to learning and scientific knowledge. But people also learn and they replicate what they learn. So I think it's a mixture of things, except that, when you go to, for instance, here in South Africa, in Johannesburg, we have the South African Music Rights Organization, where you register your original works. They have a particular template or protocol for arrangements and a particular protocol for compositions. So they just say, if you have composed, we will not consider the chord progression. So you can come up with the most beautiful chord progression, it doesn't make it a composition. So they will only consider words and melody as composition, right? So I guess it just depends on where we are and how we want to articulate these things, but they are not straightforward. It's not as simple as it's a composition or it's not a composition. It just depends how you look at it.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for
Thank
the
you
question.
so much. Wow, thank you. Okay, can we have do we have other questions? Particularly, we can take one more or two as we are getting closer to our exit point for today. Do we have any questions from our friends and colleagues you want to ask? Okay, while I'm waiting for one more or two, can I ask you, KG, there's, of course, like what you just said right now, there's an ongoing controversy here and there that, okay, songwriters are not composers. So where do you put songwriters in this case of, system thinking in terms of creativity, reproduction of song, where do you put songwriters in this field?
I think songwriters are easy to be placed than arrangers. So I feel like I've already done the hard work, right, of placing arrangers. But songwriters definitely, so we can speak about, writing new melodies, writing new words in terms of maybe lyrical authorship. And those works in and of themselves being compelling enough to persuade people who make decisions to say, oh, that's the kind of thing we'd like to hear in our church. Yes, please come and perform it. That's already gatekeeping overcome, right? And so then they allow that. And these days you have a lot of songs that are making trans-denominational movement where you know. So that is no longer, so that's a composition, someone, unless it's a traditional song, but someone sat somewhere and wrote it. Like people in South Africa, and somewhere in West Africa, Northern Africa, people in Southern Africa are singing that in their congregations because someone listened to it and say, the music director perhaps heard that song and say, I'm taking this to my church, right? So they become the decision makers of how that work comes into their cultural space and cultural encounter. But I think, you know, is composition and arranging sit in the same spot, except that the qualities are negotiated differently. The artistic qualities are negotiated differently, but a melody remains a melody. A lyric remains a lyric, right?
Wow. One layer on that while we are still waiting in case there's any. So, and I'm happy you make that particular example. Nara nara he daregele. That song is actually an arrangement. It's a combination of more 2, 3 common songs that have been around in Nigeria. I don't know if you know about this, but many of our colleagues and friends online, they know about this. So, but the fact that you see it from another perspective is also a valuable thing. But my question is this. So, you know, there's a way, like you have explained beautifully in your presentation, there's a way we conceptualize through this idea of system thinking, composer, arranger.
Yeah.
In fact, there's another one, like the one I mentioned, songwriters. Yeah, this way we have not only systematically categorized them or situate them, we have also institutionalized them, like you said, through different forms of gatekeeping, you know, institutional gatekeeping, economic gatekeeping, you know, social gatekeeping, cultural, you know, different forms, you know, professional gatekeeping. But would you say those who work in studios, who write that kind of songs, who produce songs, music producers, or just band leaders who write songs and take to the studio and record, and the song became popular or blow, to use the local parlance, are they seen as composer? Are these songwriters who go to the studio or producer who arrange songs and make it popular and produce some song, are these also, can they situate them within this systemic thinking or institutionalization of composers? Or composition is only limited to those, some of us who went to university? Please, I want you to really help us in that area.
No, so I was saying that I think, you know, the ideas, you know, I think this is the problem with colonization, that it has historically created hierarchies of knowledge. And it has created also elitism in terms of particular type of practices and works. And so, I mean, the other criticism is how someone like me or you who resides in the academy would go out to study a community of the so-called uneducated in order to produce an output for ourselves that is going to make us receive recognition as the educated when we present knowledge concerning the uneducated. The knowledge that we would not have amassed if we had not done empirical research. So, of course, you know, the politics now of knowledge production, the politics of who owns knowledge, all now under this decolonial way of thinking about knowledge production. And so, going back to your question, I think we need to start rethinking how we ascribe value, creative value, right? So composers who sit in the academy and composers who don't sit in the academy, why do we feel a need to distinguish between them? We feel a need to distinguish between them in order to ascribe elitist or elitism, right? Because without distinguishing between the two, then it's almost as though the ones in the academy feel that the value that they hold will be reduced. Right? So we are caught up in those historical politics of knowledge and institutional affiliation. And, the fact that we also say you're trained and the other person is not trained. So I think I mean, my position is that maybe we do need to really rethink how we provide terminology for these things and the histories that our terminology that we have inherited as a result. So we've inherited that. We are saying the guy in the studio is not a composer or is an inferior composer. It's an inherited view.
Wow. Thank you so much, KG. Well, again, this is an interesting moment, and I think this is what we do actually at the Organ House Seminar Series. It's a critical space as we have seen it today, and I'm happy we have KG. Like I said, some of you who have not joined when we started, KG is my close colleague. We share cubicles, we share many things, at Witwatersrand University. We've done many things together. And I'm so happy that you came here today and you show the same value that I know of you, what you are known for, even in South Africa. Thank you so much, KG. Thank you so much. This is quite a handful in terms of deep depths that you brought to this platform today. Thank you so much, KG. Thank you. So lastly, I think for some of us, I just want to remind you of our upcoming international symposium on African art music. So we are having Professor Kofi Agau and Bode Omojola in person at the Organ House, Martin Top University from July 16 to July 18. 2 days engagement, creative engagement, 1 day creative work concert, which is on the 18th. Please join us. We are waiting for you. We are looking forward to hosting you. And you can also join us online for the entire season, the entire moment of the symposium. But it promises to be a great one. Like what KG said, this is why we are creating this kind of platform, to engage culture, to engage tradition, and to expand, to challenge, to, stimulate creativity. Of course, produce knowledge. So thank you so much. So join us from on the 16th to 18th. Of course, before then, next week, we are going to see another, edition of this particular platform. Thank you so much. KG, thank you, everyone. Thank you. See you next week, the same time. Bye.